You're listening to the Utah Checkdown podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown podcast. I am Josh Furlong, and as always, happy to be back with you for another week. We're getting closer to football. I know we're still in June, but we're getting there. We're so close. Can you taste it? That sounded so cheesy. But the reality is we are getting closer. A couple weeks from now, we'll be at Big 12 Media Days, getting to talk about Utah football, all the other programs. We'll get into a bunch of that stuff later. But then the season's right around the corner, right? Like, we're still roughly, a month-ish away. About a month from now, Utah will start its fall camp, so we're close. We're within counting days that are relatively close, right? It's not like this 200 days. Whatever. I've gone on too long. So we're gonna jump into today's episode. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about it. We're gonna do an update on the final official visits of summer and the commits that Utah got this weekend. We'll also look at an interesting lawsuit that could impact the transfer portal, and then we'll do a continuation of the breakdown of Utah's schedule with a look at Cincinnati and Baylor. But first, let me tell you about our partners, Canyon View Credit Union. Every possibility begins with a spark, and possibility can grow into something even better than expected. With a clear view of what matters most, your possibilities are endless. From its first flicker at the University of Utah, U First Credit Union has grown to meet its potential and ignites your possibilities. They've grown into Canyon View Credit Union. Same roots, new path. Welcome to Canyon View Credit Union. Check out the full details at canyonviewcu.com. All right, so this weekend was a busy weekend for the University of Utah. It was a busy weekend for most programs around the country. June 20th, or the weekend, was essentially the last official visits part of the summer. So a lot of these kids will be coming in to visit their respective programs that they're interested in. Sometimes you can view this as a great opportunity to get them in the last visit. They want to save the best for last and see how things go. Others, don't read too much into that. It's more just another date on there based on how they scheduled it. So obviously being the last does give you a fresh taste in your mouth. So if you liked a program at the beginning of the official visit season and then you visit a team at the end, obviously that's going to be in more recent memory. So there is some advantages to going last, but it's not the end-all be-all. But it's still one of those dates that Utah specifically tries to work really hard on to make sure that this is kind of the cream of the crop. Not to say that the people that visited before that weren't, but you're trying to get, the last best impression there and make sure that you can get some of these guys, committed or at least have a good impression of the state of Utah, of the program, all that kind of stuff. So as it stands, Utah had something around 40 to 45. I didn't update my numbers on that. Smaller than last year, but still a good size. Utah, they swung for the fence on some of these guys. They, went big game hunting, quote unquote, and brought in a lot of talented players. We've talked about how, in the state of Idaho, state of Arizona, the state of Texas, they're bringing in the top kids from these states. And so, at the very least, they're trying to get in the door. They're trying to make sure that their name is known, and trying to get there. I'll get into the commits in a sec, but let me kind of recap the official visits. And we don't fully know all the details of this because it just barely wrapped up. But Utah brought in 5-star offensive tackle Felix Ojo. This is Utah's number one target by large portion, right? Like, this is the guy that they hope to be able to replace Spencer Fano. This is the guy that they hope that would be, the next great opportunity to advance the offensive line with Jim Harding. This is their guy. And, he's a Texas kid with a heavy lean to Texas. That's kind of obvious. Texas is a great program. They've been in a great spot the last few years. And so to pull a kid away from, a hometown type team is going to be tough. But he's the number 2 recruit in Texas, according to 24/7 Sports. He canceled his Oklahoma visit to close out with Utah. His previous visits were with Texas, Michigan, Ohio State, and Florida. So, this is the best of the best. He has something like 50-plus offers. You can imagine what they are. 5-star kid, you would imagine that he's going to have all of those things. And so this is the cream of the crop, right? This is who they want. If they can secure him, that would be great. And by all accounts, it sounds like there was at least a good impression there. How that fares remains to be seen. I'm sure NIL will be a big factor into this. Obviously, getting the opportunity to play will be a big factor. And Utah has, at the very least, the opportunity to play. The NIL will be a different conversation, especially when you're going up against Texas. But if this is really their number 1 guy, I would have to imagine that this is something that they spare no expense to be able to make sure that they get him. Now, he's obviously not the only offensive line commit that they want. They've got some other ones. You've got the Obot kid from Idaho. They're still pretty high on him. They would love to pair him and Ojo together. You get both of those guys, and you've got quite the tandem for the next, iteration of this offensive line. So, would be huge. I know some people don't really find this position to be too sexy, right? But if you can have a great offensive line, as we've seen what Utah can do and what they can potentially do this year, we've seen what Oregon has done. We've seen what Miami's done. We've seen, what a lot of these other programs around the country, if you have a fantastic offensive line, there's a lot you can do with that team. Obviously, there has to be pieces around it, and you can't just put all of your stock into that offensive line. But if you have those dudes in the trenches that can really handle everything, your offense can be so much better, right? Your run game can improve. Your passing attack can be better. Obviously, you have to have an accurate QB on all that stuff. But if you have a great offensive line, it's really tough for teams to be able to combat you. So this is where they're going all in. There were some other stars as part of this. You got the 2 twins, Jaron Pula and Keenan Pula, 2 wide receivers from the state of Utah. Jaron is ranked 5th in the state, according to 24/7, and Keenan is 8th in the state. These are 2 kids that were committed to UCLA back in September 2024. So it's been a whole year that these kids have committed. But there is interest, right? There's interest in Utah, a hometown school. Utah's not the only one, right? Like there's other programs that would want these 2. But getting those 2 specifically, not only for local recruiting, as well as just 2 people in a position of need would be fantastic, right? And given Utah's kind of landing spot of where they're at with wide receiver, there's real potential, once again, like Felix, that these 2 could be starters at freshman, especially if they can live up to the expectations that many have for these 2. They still have to go through their season at Lone Peak, and Lone Peak's going to be stacked this year. Usually a pretty solid team, but this is a team that has a lot of Division I type talent on there, and so you're going to see a really solid Lone Peak team this year. At least it should be, right? And these 2 will be big factors in that, being able to factor in for a state championship and then potentially a run either at UCLA or Utah or whomever else that they decide. But I know these 2 are priorities for Utah as well. You've got a ranking, right? I would say that Felix Ojo is number 1. You probably have Celeste Moa at number 2. Number 3 would be Obot. And then these 2 are probably high up there as well. You've got, you can't ever not have enough 4-star wide receivers. So this would be a great opportunity for Utah. So once again, 2 other great assets that Utah could utilize, especially if you can flip them from UCLA. Utah obviously plays UCLA this year, and so interesting side note there, pulling him away from Big Ten team. There's a lot there that you can use as recruiting wins. Beyond that, Utah also had Isa Naliai. I am sorry for the pronunciation. I'm pretty sure I got it right. Usually I'm pretty good with this, but every once in a while I'm not so great. So Naliai, Timpview High, 3-star corner. He's ranked number 10 in the state. Another phenomenal talent. You watch his film and he's aggressive. He's got talent. He's a ball hawking corner. There was one play that I saw specifically on his highlight tapes where, he sat in coverage for a bit. waiting for the play to break down, and then immediately explodes to the ball, catches it with a sideline catch, and it's a great opportunity for a turnover. So this is exactly the type of player that Utah would want. Whether they can get him, remains to be seen. But there's some good ground there. I know a crystal ball from Blair Anguloa from 24/7 Sports was put in there over the weekend that he is going to commit to Utah. So we'll see. Once again, another great opportunity for Utah to get a local kid, an impact kid that would be pretty dynamic for them. Utah also brought in 3-star corner Dylan Waters, a Texas kid who has trended toward Utah. So you've got potentially a lot of players that came in this weekend that are trending towards Utah. Now, Felix Ojo, like I said, that remains to be seen, but there's a lot of good momentum. And when you have a lot of players that are, together in the same mindset, same momentum, it's really easy to kind of buy into that. Now, Ojo, for example, he has to go back and he has to look at everything. So you can't be blinded by it. But it is nice when you have some of the guys that you could potentially be playing with, if you build a connection with them while you're on your visit, all that kind of stuff, that helps, right? And beyond that, Utah got 3 commitments this weekend to move them up to 9 for the year. I wouldn't be surprised if by the time you listen to this podcast, there's a couple more. We'll see. But I've got Twitter open right here, watching things as I'm doing this, just in case something does happen. There was a lot of quote-unquote back signals from the coaching staff this weekend. Some of those, were in reference to guys that are already announced, but there's, potential for some other guys. As I said, Nalier was got a crystal ball for Utah, so there's potential there. You have some other people as well. So on Friday, it started off the momentum with tight end Bear Fisher, 3-star tight end from Arizona. Has some good offers from Arizona, BYU, Iowa State, North Carolina, and Washington State. So there's, a great tight end prospect. Probably still underrated right now. We'll see what happens in his senior year. But Utah really liked what he had, and, Bear obviously liked what Utah provided. And let's be real, this is a phenomenal name. Bear Fisher, that's great. It fits in Utah. It's just a perfect situation. Saturday night, so late Saturday night actually, Utah picked up the 3-star athlete Perrion Williams, mostly a wide receiver. This kid was on his official visit, or at least had just wrapped up his official visit and had committed. This is something that, he was bought into the program, came in, and immediately made his intentions known. So a great opportunity for Utah. You do get another wide receiver. He has the ability to play other spots, but wide receiver is kind of where he's pegged right now. So great opportunity for Utah there. And then on Sunday night, you got 3-star offensive tackle Rowdy Pierce. He's from Texas. This obviously adds to that offensive line potential. You've got some great potential as an inside offensive lineman there. That Utah can utilize as well. You're not just losing your tackles, you're going to lose some inside offensive linemen as well. And so somebody like a Rowdy Pierce, who they're high on, I know he hasn't had the offer sheet that many would expect, but Utah's projecting him to be very good and, has the potential to be able to be a disruptor in the offensive line if he makes the right moves. And so you've got 3, impactful commits over the weekend, all on the offensive side of the ball. Utah's pushing heavy to be able to improve that side and being able to grow. So, like I said, up to 9 right now. You're going to start seeing a lot more coming off the board soon. This is the time of the year where a lot of these kids, they either want to take their time and do it during the season, kind of see how things go, or they're going to go right now and they don't want it as a distraction as they go into the senior year. Quite honestly, there's an opportunity there for a lot of these kids too, to commit to a program and then have your senior season, and then you're kind of locked in and make that so that it's not a distraction, but also it allows you to be able to get that commitment, right? Things can change during your senior year, and assuming that a school still wants you, you've at least made that commitment known and you're locked in. So nothing is final, right? Some of these guys that commit can flip. Some of these guys that have already passed on Utah, in the last 2 months or so, they can flip to Utah. Quite honestly, a lot of these things, you're going to see are going to be based on this year, right? Utah may be slow going right now, only with their 9 commits. But if Utah can have a decent season or an improved season by any means, that's going to go a long way. And then you have kids that were on the fence saying, you know what, like, is Utah going to be back? Do they have the right momentum? That kind of stuff. That bodes well, right? Still have to have that fit, still have to feel comfortable there. That has to be different than what you had. But these coaches, just because the official visits are over, doesn't mean that they're not going to stop talking to these guys, trying to recruit them, up until the signing day, which we still don't officially know when that signing day will be. Usually it's in early December. There's still a debate on when that will be. But let's, for all intents and purposes, say that it is in December. You want to get these guys locked in and ready to go. So that's it where it stands. Like I said, expect to have some more players that are going to commit here soon. You're going to get a lot more as they get ready to get into their senior season and kind of not have that as a distraction. So moving on. Over the weekend, there was an interesting lawsuit that was presented, and the only reason I'm bringing this up is because it's going to have potential ramifications in the sport. Wisconsin sued, we'll just say sued Miami because of one of their players, Xavier Lucas, who had originally signed a rev share agreement with Wisconsin early on in the year. Now with this said, the rev share agreement couldn't be, it can't be in effect until July 1st. And so because of the House settlement, all that kind of stuff, he signed the agreement in expectation that would happen. Well, what happened is Lucas wanted out of Wisconsin. Wisconsin said, no, you signed this rev share agreement. I believe it was for 2 years or something like that. I can't remember what it was. And they refused to put him in the transfer portal. Now, schools are required to put you in the transfer portal if you make that intention known. Wisconsin didn't do that. So there's some issues there. But then Lucas, just essentially left without even being in the portal and committed to Miami immediately. And so Wisconsin is alleging that there was tampering. Now, look, we've had these conversations many times about tampering. It's happening everywhere. These coaches remain in contact with every single recruit that they've been involved with. This isn't something where only a few select programs are doing this. Every single program is doing it to some extent. Some is a little bit more overt. Some is a little bit more, I wouldn't even call it illegal, but more on the edge of being inappropriate, trying to sway somebody to come out of their school and go. As I've mentioned in past podcasts, tampering is a serious offense, even like in the NFL, right? If you tamper in the time that you're not allowed to tamper, or the legal tampering period, you can be fined, you can lose draft picks, that kind of stuff. Now, college football doesn't have anything right there as it relates to tampering, but this could be a precedent-setting situation where maybe the transfer portal has some sort of effect, right? Especially now that these guys are signing into rev share agreements. Athletic departments are paying players as of July 1st. There's potential for more contractual agreements as it relates to kind of how an athlete is on a roster. Now, as part of this could mean that the transfer portal window, doesn't really exist anymore, right? A judge could come out there and rule that, you can't have a transfer portal window, that guys could transfer at any times they want. That would be a massive blow to collegiate sports. And I think, there's some fair trade arguments that could be made to kind of to fight that. But at the end of the day, it's going to have some ramifications on that. Will it set a precedence to allow the schools to keep the players longer? We'll see, right? I don't need to get into the nitty-gritty here because, one, we don't know what it's going to be. This may settle. It may be something that, we don't hear much about. But the reality is a lot of these things are going to be challenged, and you're going to start seeing a little bit differences in the sport. Some of them are going to be good. Some of them are going to be bad. We don't really know. And, I'd argue that the transfer portal is still a good opportunity to equalize the talent throughout the country. There is still the opportunities that the teams that pay the most are going to compile the best rosters, that kind of stuff. But at the same time, you're still getting a lot more spread out teams. I don't think you're going to have these dominant teams like the Alabamas or the Georgias of the past, in the sense where you just stockpile a lot of talent, that depth pieces continue to move forward, and you continue to just churn out these talents, right? A lot of these players want to play. And so if they're not getting the playing time or don't see a path to playing time, they're going to transfer. And so you're going to start seeing, and you have already started seeing, more of these guys moving on to different programs. And you're starting to see that talent acquisition at these other programs improve, right? And a lot of it is still the top line guys, your starters, or maybe you're too deep. But for the most part, you're starting to see some of that. And so we'll see what happens if the transfer portal window, is erased. That adds so much more instability to the sport. Right now, there's conversations to be had, or that are being had, about when the portal window should exist. As I've mentioned previously, there's been a movement to be able to get the portal window changed to January. There could be one in just summer. We'll see what happens, but there's a lot of information based on these things. The lawsuit is going to be involved in that, but it's not something that I would worry about too much, but just something to be aware of. So let's jump into the schedule preview. We're deep in the heart of Utah's schedule at this point. Right now, there's 4 games left in the season. The next 2 are Cincinnati and Baylor. And so we're going to jump to Cincinnati. This Cincinnati game is the last game of Utah's stretch where they have a 6-week period where they stay in the state of Utah. Yes, you do travel to, Provo, but you're staying in the state of Utah. And as I've mentioned, that's a huge advantage for this team in the sense that they don't have to leave the state. Now, there's still so many questions about this Utah team. We've talked about them in the past, and if you haven't listened to them, by all means, go back and listen to them. I went over an offense, I went over the defense, kind of looked at the position breakdowns and stuff like that to see how this team is. We're assuming, and I think most people are assuming, that Utah's going to be improved. Now, how much improved remains to be seen, right? They could be 6-6, they could be 7-5, but I would assume that they're going to be, at minimum 7-5 based on kind of what they have returning. That doesn't mean that they don't have questions, right? As we've talked about, Utah's wide receiver room needs to improve. We've talked about, can Devin Dampier be the guy that can lead Utah's offense and make that acclimation to the Power 4 level? We'll see. I mean, everything's trending that way. There's a lot of good momentum towards this Utah team. If you believe Phil Steele, Utah is one of the top teams in the conference and will challenge for a Big 12 championship. That's on the table, or they could miss the playoffs, or not the playoffs, excuse me, the bowl games, entirely like they did last year. I tend to believe that that's not going to be the case, but that's neither here nor there. Anyways, at this point in the season, with 4 games left, you've played 8 games, you're going to know a good deal about this Utah team, right? You're also going to know a good deal about these other teams, Cincinnati and Baylor. And so we're getting to that point in the year where preseason projections especially, or me having conversations about this team right now, is going to be so drastically different, right? We're just looking at this from the sense that this is who they are coming into the season. It's hard to predict how they are 10 weeks into the season or 9 weeks, depending on how things go. I'm talking buys and all that kind of stuff. This is tough to predict on how the Cincinnati team can be. So they do come to Rice-Eccles Stadium on November 1st. Cincinnati has to play Baylor the week before, so it's no easy out the week before for this Cincinnati team. 3 of the last 4 games are at home before traveling to Salt Lake City, but you do get Baylor, and which we'll talk about here shortly. Baylor is projected to be one of the top teams in the conference. So not an easy out. Schedule it as a loss if you want. I'm not entirely sure. We'll see. But, it's not going to be an easy game before coming into Rice-Eccles Stadium. And if Utah is even remotely in contention for a title, this can be an even more challenging game for Cincinnati. I don't think Cincinnati will be quite to the level where they're challenging for a Big 12 title, but that's not to say that they couldn't. They have some pieces, and we'll get into that. But there's still a lot more questions about this team that need to be answered. As you'll remember, Cincinnati moved to the Big 12. They were in the AAC, so this is only their 3rd year at the Power 4 level. They're making that acclimation to that transition period into it, trying to be able to get into that level where you've got the depth, where you've got the talent to be able to do it. It's much easier than, let's say, Utah had back in the transition from the Mountain West to the Pac-12, but it's it's not as difficult as it used to be in the sense that you can go to the transfer portal. But you still have to have success, and you have to still have good momentum. You have to have good coaching staff, all that kind of stuff. Last year, Cincinnati went 5-7. They were 3-6 in the Big 12. Weren't really that competitive in the conference. Tough situation for head coach Scott Satterfield. This quite honestly could be a make or break season for him. They signed him to a good sized contract, but at the same time, if you're not producing and you, let's say, go 5-7 again, I have to imagine at the very least his seat is very hot going into next year, if not completely out. So, really curious to kind of see what happens, but we're not going to know that right now. The last meeting these two programs had was never. They've never played, which is a little odd to me. I would have thought that Utah would have played Cincinnati at least once over their time, but these two teams have never played. So this will be the first ever meeting between these two programs. Interesting situation, but fun to be able to have new opponents that Utah's never played. Preseason win predictions is 6.5 by the odds makers out there. So getting to at least bowl eligibility this year, at least based on the odds, but trying to get to that 2-game plus win advantage where they were 5-7, trying to get to that 7-5 is kind of where they're slated. The SP Plus strength of schedule has them at 59th, so they have a decent schedule. It's not anything earth-shattering. SP Plus has them ranked as the 66th best team in the country. So really just kind of a middling type team that is trying to improve. Phil still has them tied for 9th in the Big 12 with Kansas. So I would assume that Kansas is a much more improved team and better than the Cincinnati squad, but he sees them as kind of the same type of team. This is a team that they did have a disappointing season. They didn't live up to their expectations. Their normally strong defense was below average in most categories. Granted, most of that strong defense came, at a different level. You were at the, a different conference. You were in the group of 5 level. That's not to say those defenses can't be effective, and obviously we saw them in playoff runs and different things that way. So it's not to say that the Cincinnati team could never be there or have that talent. But it's different to be able to have that on a week-to-week basis. And so their defense hasn't lived up to their expectations for the last 5 years. They had good coverage grades, but that was kind of about it. Quarterback Brandon Sorsby, he's a decent quarterback, and I'll get into that shortly. But, he didn't have kind of the year that they needed to fully take advantage of what it was. So, we'll see kind of what happens from them. Just some general stats to kind of paint the picture. They were 36 in rushing offense, so they were decent, but not great. 55th in passing offense, so 236 yards. Just really an average team by all accounts on the offensive side of the ball. They were 36 in total offense. I don't know if you'd call that average. That would be a little bit above average, but this was a team that, had potential. They just didn't maximize it and didn't do what they needed to be able to improve. Part of that was red zone offense was terrible. They were 100th in red zone offense. They managed only 80% of scoring there, and their defense was even worse at 113th in red zone defense. So Cincinnati had a hard time scoring in the red zone and then allowed way more in the red zone for their opponent, and that's why you only won 3 games in Cincinnati's second year in the Big 12. So you got to improve that as would be expected, but that's just kind of where it is, right? The defense just they were fine. They weren't great. They weren't elite by any means and gave up a little bit too much that the offense couldn't keep up with either. So it was a different situation for this team, and they're obviously looking for improvement. For this year, they lost 15 players. Not a ton that were huge impact. I mean, they lost their 2 top corners, so that's going to have an impact on you with Jordan Robinson and Jordan Young. They both went to Virginia and Arkansas, respectively. You do lose your 3rd leading receiver to Miami and Tony Johnson, and you lose another receiver in Sterling Burkhalter to Wake Forest. So there was definitely some pieces that left, but this isn't one of those things where you were just gutted of all of your talent. Now, I'd argue the corners are probably the most impactful. Obviously a 3rd leading receiver is not great, but you can make up for that in in transfer portals or depth pieces, whatever that may be. As that stands, the Cincinnati team brought in 16 new players, and 12 of them are expected to be starters. So you've got a roster that is pretty heavily leaning in the transfer portal. Half of those guys are on the offense, half of those guys are on the defense. And so it's a pretty even split of that. But there's going to be a lot of push to be able to make these transfer guys hit. And so there's a lot of questions as it relates to that. As I've mentioned every single time, Utah's in a similar position on the offensive side of the ball. So this isn't unusual for teams, but it just means there's more questions as it relates to that program. So that's how it goes. Key roster pieces. So Sorsby, as I mentioned, he's a returning quarterback, junior. Last year he threw for 2,800 yards, 18 touchdowns, 7 interceptions at a 64% completion percentage. Not bad, not great. If your defense is holding up and you're able to do well in the run game, that's a fine number, right? You're going to win some games with that, but you do have to have a defense that's going to limit things a little bit for that to work. He also added 447 rushing yards and 9 touchdowns as the second leading rusher, but he's not generally the guy that you're going to look to as he's going to run the ball a ton. He will, but he's not like a true dual threat quarterback where you have to respect it as much as maybe some of these other guys that Utah's had over the years. So he is capable. He's got the ability. He can do it, but this isn't necessarily where they want him to succeed. It just means that he's good at escaping the pocket, and he can make some plays. But hasn't been incredibly accurate. 64%. Yeah, it's good, but he's had 7 interceptions. They want that numbers down. Either way, this is a quarterback that needs to make improvement, but he's not terrible, right? I would put him just in the good category. He's not going to be one of the elite quarterbacks, or at least he hasn't shown to be one of the elite quarterbacks right now in the conference, but there is still potential there. And as he grows through the program, he now has another year. There's potential where Sorsby could be one of the best in the conference. I still think he's probably a tier below, but I think there's potential there. In the running back room, you do bring in Wisconsin running back Tawi Walker. He was their leading rusher at Wisconsin at 864 yards and 10 touchdowns. This could absolutely be the difference maker for Sorsby, right? If you have a guy that can do really well in the run game, and maybe you don't need Sorsby, but at least if you have that opportunity to be able to utilize multiple talents back there, like Utah's trying to do with Devin Dampier and, Wayshawn Parker and whatever else they've got back there with like Nate Johnson, etc. That just makes it much harder for defenses to kind of respect it, right? Especially if Walker is effective. They also have returning rusher Evan Pryor. He's a senior. He was their third leading rusher last year with 418 yards and 6 touchdowns. So there's talent there. There's opportunity there. This should be an improved room. Cincinnati should be able to do well to be able to run the ball. And so, that's going to be a great opportunity for them. The biggest disadvantage for Cincinnati, I would say, maybe not the biggest because there's other disadvantages here, is the wide receiver room is essentially rebuilt, right? So similar to Utah, how they're rebuilding a wide receiver room, this Cincinnati program is going to be looking for transfer portal players to essentially hit and be their guys. And they've, fortunately for them, done really well in the portal to be able to bring in guys that have talent and understand what it takes to be a great receiver. So they bring in Jeff Caldwell. He's a veteran senior. He's from the FCS ranks at Lindenwood. He was the leading receiver there at 1,000 yards, 11 touchdowns, averaged 19.5 yards per catch. And so this is a talented guy that, as long as he makes that transition to the Power 4 level, he's at least your deep threat guy. He's your number one target type opportunity, and there's potential there. You also bring in Colorado State's leading receiver in Caleb Goody. He's a junior, had 436 yards and 4 touchdowns. That's the leading receiver, so there's not a ton of production there necessarily, but it shows that he can go up and get the ball at 20.8 yards average. He's a talented kid that obviously can have more potential at a place like Cincinnati, and so we'll see what happens there. You also then bring in Cyrus Allen. He's a senior from Texas A&M. He was their 5th leading receiver last year at 269 yards and 1 touchdown. So there's some talent there. I think I don't want to know if they've improved, but they've definitely done well to rebuild that roster. But it just remains to be seen if they can have a connection with Sorsby, if Sorsby can be accurate, that kind of stuff. So that remains to be seen. You do, however, bring back tight end Joe Royer. I really emphasized that Joe, didn't I? Joe Royer. He was the 2nd leading receiver for Cincinnati at 521 yards and 3 touchdowns. So you do have the advantage there where you're bringing in a guy that has some experience, so it's not all lost for Sorsby trying to replace everything. The biggest hurt here, and as I said that earlier with the wide receivers, this one I'd say is probably the harder one, is your offensive line is replacing 4 guys. 3 of those guys from the portal are expected to be kind of in that starting unit. You do have guys that are talented at their former programs. You have Joe Cotton. He was at South Dakota, so an FCS program. Taron Tayo, Ball State. He was the 2nd best on offense and had an 82.0 pass blocking grade, a 74.7 run blocking grade. He's arguably the best one to come out of this group. And then you get a kid from Albany that is going to factor in there as well. So as I say all the time with these offensive lines that are returning, only one guy or so, it's a tough task, right? You do bring back your center in Gavin Gerhardt, which is an advantage because you at least have that communication with the quarterback, a guy that's had a ton of snaps. He can be the stable force there, but you do need those other pieces to be able to hit if Cincinnati wants to be able to be what they need to be. On the defensive side, you're bringing 2 back. 2 were coming from the portal. It's led by Dante Corleone as a defensive tackle. He had 27 total pressures last year. This is a talented kid who is going to be disruptive in the backfield. It's going to fit exactly with what Cincinnati wants to do with being aggressive and winning the trenches, that kind of stuff. So he's going to put a lot of pressure on teams and quarterbacks to be able to make sure that they're going to be able to work really hard. You also return Jake Golday as a linebacker. He was the 2nd best player to be able to come back to Cincinnati. Really talented kid, graded high. To have him in that 2nd unit with the linebacker unit is a big advantage. And then you bring in, portal players for your secondary in Matthew McDoom, Christian Harrison, Xavier Williams. These are all guys that have had some experience, have done really well, but they're going to need to do even better at Cincinnati to be able to make sure that this defense goes. So the biggest questions coming into this is there's just a lot of new pieces, especially on that defensive side of the ball where you're going to be relying on new guys to essentially take over. Can those gel? Can they live up to the expectations that Cincinnati's put on them? There's a lot of optimism this team will be improved from last year, but how much? There's a lot of teams in this conference that are going to be middling just simply because there's a lot more parity, and so it'll be a challenge. And then can Brendan Sorsby make the progress that he needs to? He's good, but not great. Can he take it to that next level, or maybe he can at least be closer to great, right? Can he be the one that leads this team to where it needs to be? So really fascinated with this team. It's not one that you look at and immediately are scared of. This isn't like an Arizona State team where you could see the momentum building, right? I know everybody picked Arizona State last year, but there was momentum building with Kenny Dillingham. There was kind of this trajectory of what this program could be. There is maybe some of that with Cincinnati, but I would say it's much more muted and quiet than it would be than Arizona State last year. So don't count them out by any means. This is a team that can do some damage, but I think there's just so many more pieces that have to connect and fit that it's an upward climb for this Bearcats team to be able to be great. So we'll know what it is for this team, 8 weeks, 8 games into the schedule, and this is the 9th game into the schedule, excuse me. But right now, there's still a lot of questions about the Cincinnati team. So let's move on to Baylor. Baylor is that team that is really fascinating. Utah played Baylor last year. Obviously, it was a weird game. Weird doesn't even describe really what it was. This was played on September 7th in a non-conference game, mind you. So Utah essentially had another Big 12 opponent on its schedule, and it was scheduled as a non-conference game because of a previous agreement before these two teams were conference mates. So this game was one where Cam Rising played, and I know I'm going to bring this up and people don't like it, but Cam Rising played, and there was conversations in the press box that game that Utah was going to roll, right? The way Utah started was incredibly hot. It looked like it was going to be 50-0. I mean, there was everything going right for Utah. That's not to say that there wasn't things that Baylor was doing that was disrupting Utah, but Utah was just clearly the better team. Cam Rising was dealing. It looked like he was in fine form, and that it really backed up what Utah was expecting him to be for the year, right? They bought in on everything around Cam Rising, and it was going to be the year. It was going to be the year they were going to go to the playoffs. It was going to be the year that they won the Big 12. There's a lot going into it. And in an instant, Cam Rising rolls out to the sideline, trying to extend a play. Yes, we've heard it many times that Cam should have thrown the ball away. Don't even put yourself in that position. The reality is Cam was a fighter, and he tried to extend a play that, wasn't going to really make a difference in the game, if we're being honest. And, he makes the play or something else happens, and everybody's fine with it. But what happened is he gets pushed off the sidelines. You can disagree or agree on whether it was after the fact, after he crossed the sideline boundary, or whatever. Either way, he was pushed out of bounds and into a Gatorade hydration station. And he hit his throwing hand, in a way that initially looked like, you jam it or you dislocate it, or there's something of a problem there. We later come out to find out that it essentially ended his career. There was nerve damage. He's still recovering from that. And a play that looked to be, pretty innocent, depending on which side of the ball you're on, turned out to be a game changer for Utah. This was a complete, game-altering injury, season-altering injury that really just messed up Utah. Utah squeaks out a win, winning 23-12, but obviously the rest of the season was altered by this. So, you get that context coming back to this Baylor game. The last time Baylor played Utah before that was in Waco, Texas, in one of the hottest games I've ever been to. The players were getting blisters on their feet. I mean, there's been two games between these two teams that have had their own memories, and it's the only two times that Utah has played Baylor. So interesting. Utah has won both of those games, so Utah has a 2-0 record. But this one is a little bit different, especially with what Baylor can be. So this game will be played on Saturday, November 15th, in Waco, Texas. Utah gets a bye before this game. So this is their second bye. You get an opportunity to kind of reset. You have that opportunity if you're injured, which there's going to be injuries at this point in the season. You can hopefully heal. You can hopefully have an opportunity for your last final run where you have 3 games to end the season, and maybe you're in contention for a conference, tournament or conference title. So, good opportunity for buys. Utah's buys really set up well. There's other teams, for example, like BYU. Theirs doesn't set up as what you would think is as favorable. They have a bye, I believe, in week 3. I think we talked about, and then later that they have, that is a bit of a challenge. But I would say that Utah's bye is coming at a good time. But Baylor also has a bye the week before. So they play UCF the week before their bye, so the same week that Utah plays Cincinnati. And then these two have a bye week before meeting up in Waco. Now, that is really fascinating to me because this Baylor team is being talked about as being one of the top teams in the conference. And there's reasons why for that, and I'll get into that. But if you believe Phil Still, he has them as the best team. He actually has them tied with Iowa State and Utah, but he has Baylor as kind of that top team that should get the most recognition coming into the season, right? So if these two teams, let's go off of Phil Still's predictions. let's say that Baylor and Utah are two of the teams that are at the top of the conference or somewhere, in the realm of being in conversations as a title. This becomes a massive game. This becomes a play-in game, essentially, to likely the championship game. This could be an opportunity for the playoffs on the line. Look, I don't want to hype these games up too much because it's just one game, but when you have a game of this magnitude, assuming that both of these programs are what they say they are, this becomes a very pivotal game, and now you get a bye week to prepare. So you get 2 weeks, and we're going to see which team is better at preparation. Now, both of these teams coming into this game could just be terrible, right? They could both be great. One could be great, one could be bad. That's the great thing about this sport is we don't know. But I would assume that Baylor is going to be one of the best teams in this conference just based on what they've got returning. So assume that Baylor is going to be a good team here. Regardless of what Utah is this year, this is going to be a tough out. You're traveling to Texas. You're traveling in a place that is now familiar because you've played there once, but you're traveling in a situation where it's late in the season and you've got to be playing at the top of your game if you really want to consider being a conference title contender. We don't know if either one of these teams will be there, but, that's where you have to be. So at least it's not going to be in the scorching heat. It'll be much cooler. You're not going to probably have 110-degree minimum. You're going to have a much better situation there on November 15th. So, kudos to that so that we don't get that game. This Baylor team is projected to win 7.5 games this year. It's the exact same number as Utah, in the Vegas odds. According to Vegas, there's other teams with 8.5. That's the highest in this conference, but 7.5 for Baylor and Utah. The SP Plus strength of schedule is 46th, so they play a decent schedule, nothing too hard. Good enough that you can get some wins, but there's going to be some challenging games along the way. And then SP Plus has this team ranked as 35th in the country. So curious to see there. Now, this just kind of the reason why Baylor is getting the hype that it is. This is a team that lost 4 of its first 6 games last year. So you're thinking, okay, how is this mattering? But then they reeled off 6 straight games, 6 straight wins to end the season. So they had these quite dynamically different halves of the seasons, right? First 4 games, they were trying to get involved. You had Dave Aranda, who was on the hot seat. This was going to be the situation where, finally they could make a decision, and it wasn't looking good for him, and suddenly, he was going to be out. Then the next 6 games happened, and his hot seat immediately went to cool. You now have a team that is coming back with a ton of the same players, and you've just closed out the season with 6 straight wins in the regular season against Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, TCU, West Virginia, Houston, and Kansas. So there's some good teams in there, right? Texas Tech, they're not the same team that they will be this year, or at least we're assuming, but at the same time, a good team. TCU was pretty solid last year. West Virginia was decent. Oklahoma State, they were garbage. They didn't win anything. Houston, especially late in the season, was much better, much improved, but you still get a win over them. And then Kansas, they were coming in hot at the end of the year as well, and they get a win over Kansas. And so things were starting to click, right? They took some lumps early. The defense, they still had some struggles, and I'll get into that shortly, but this offense really clicked, and it started to work. As it relates to that, they're now bringing back a majority of their offense and some of their defense. So this is a team that is going to be one of the best in the country in terms of returning production. There's a lot of opportunities here. Doesn't always mean that that's going to translate to the next year, but it doesn't hurt by any means, especially if you're able to, harken back to those last 6 games of the season, kind of get that vibe, get that momentum going. Things are going to be much more improved. So, very good opportunity for this Baylor squad to be able to repeat what they did at the end of the year. This offense, they were slightly above in some categories over the last 5 years. So this is a team that has generally been decent on offense, but they were slightly above in some of these categories this last year. So they are 19th in scoring offense, 34th in passing offense, 20th in total offense. So really solid in just your standard stats. They were 32nd in third down conversion, so they did well to convert it to third down. But their biggest, if you want to call it that, their biggest issue was, 75th in red zone conversion. They converted at 83%. That's touchdowns and field goals. And so they did well to move the ball, but didn't always do well in the red zone. I would have to imagine that improves this year. It's not a guarantee, but at the same time, as a team that's been working together, comes together again for another season, you'd have to assume that improves a bit. So I would assume those numbers are going to be pretty similar to what they were last year. You may take some, you may be less than that, you may be higher than that. Either way, you're going to still see a pretty potent offense, if not a more potent offense, based on all the returners. Defense was pretty on par with its last 5 seasons, and so there wasn't anything out of the norm, but at the same time, it's still not living up to the expectations of the offense. So, for example, you have this team as 81st in scoring defense, giving up too many points, 72nd in run defense, giving up too many yards, 94th in pass defense, so giving up even more yards through the air, which led you to 87th in total defense, just your standard stats. 35th in third down, so they were decent at stopping third down conversions, 11th and fourth down conversions, so even better at stopping them, and then 36th in red zone defense. So they were, they would let teams move the ball at ease, but then they would lock down pretty well in the red zone. And you could see that with this team the last 2 years when they played Utah. The first year, they moved the ball decently, but it wasn't great. But in the red zone, they did a little bit different, they were better, whatever. The defense is still the area that needs to improve to match this offense. And I think they've done well to get there, and we'll get there in a second. So outgoing transfers, they lost 17 players, but most of those players were depth pieces. So you do lose those second line guys that have been in the program that may be kind of the guys that are replacing your starters should injuries happen or whatever. But for the most part, you're not really losing pieces that are going to be devastating to your program based on what you have returning. One of the more familiar names was DeQuan Finn. He was the quarterback before Sawyer Robertson took over. He transferred to Miami, Ohio. But he was clearly out of his depth there at Baylor, was not the guy that they needed, just wasn't able to generate the way that they hoped he would. They thought he could be a much better quarterback, and it just didn't work out, and Sawyer Robertson became the star. So, that's who you lose, so nothing too bad. And then incoming transfers, you have 22 guys, and a majority of these guys, I wouldn't call it a majority, a lot of these guys have the potential to be starters, or at least those second unit guys that are going to get some reps as well. So they did well to really bring on talent that is potentially going to improve and really help this Baylor team. One of those being 4-star quarterback Walker White. He comes from Auburn after one season. And so, if Sawyer Robertson is out for any reason, there's an assumption that Walker White can be the guy to kind of take over and help. You obviously don't want to necessarily go to White yet. You would hope that you have him next year as he gets into the system, but they did bring in another quarterback that can be of a talent. So there's potential there. And then let's go into the key roster pieces. So Sawyer Robertson is going to be your number one guy, right? Makes a lot of sense. Threw for 3,071 yards last year, 28 touchdowns, and only had 8 interceptions, only relative, and then 62.2% completion percentage. He was actually ranked 25th in passing yards in the country and 21st in yards per game. So this is a quarterback that has a lot of potential in the passing game. He can do a lot with his arm. Utah saw him a little bit, but nothing too crazy. This is a guy that really kind of came on late and did well for this Baylor squad. So this is a guy coming in with a lot of confidence, a lot of momentum. He's done well for the program, and it's going to be a different situation now having a guy that is solid and able to do what they need him to do. As I mentioned, the backup is Walker White. If you're Baylor, you're hoping you're not getting to White, but we don't really know what's going to be there. In the running back room, so the guys behind him, they return their top 2 rushers, and the first one is Bryson Washington, who I would say is probably one of the top returning running backs in the conference. You can make some cases for other guys, but as a freshman, this guy had 1,028 yards, 12 touchdowns and averaged 5.87 yards per carry. He was the leader on offense in PFF scores, so he had a grade of 86.8. He did not play against Utah last year, did not play the first 2 games, and still finished with 1,000 yards. This is a guy that's going to be a problem, right? Especially if you pair that with Robertson's arm. This can be a pretty potent offense that can do well in the run game, can do well in the passing game, and so you've got to honestly respect what Bryson Washington can do. Can he make that jump his sophomore year as well? Was last year just kind of one of those years where you're not expecting much from a freshman? That's the hard part, is trying to figure out how these guys project to the next year as they become at the top of the scouting report, right? Late in the season, as he developed, that's a big reason for why Baylor won, is because he started to come on strong as well. So we'll see now that he's at the top of the scouting report next to, a Sawyer Robertson, what that can mean. But there's a lot of optimism that he can be a very talented kid that is going to move forward with this program. Behind him is Dawson Pendergrass. He's coming in as a junior. Returning from last year, he was the second leading rusher as well, and he added 671 yards and 6 touchdowns for an average of 5.5 yards, 5.6. 2 awesome running backs that can do well. A great 1-2 tandem. Like I said, Bryson Washington is going to be your star, but Dawson Pendergrass can absolutely do well and be an opportunity for you as well. So really, really interesting situation there. He had 69 yards against Utah last year. We'll see what happens there. Wide receivers. They bring back their 2 leading wide receivers in Josh Cameron, who's a senior. He finished with 754 yards and 10 touchdowns. You then also have Ashton Hawkins, who's a 5th-year senior. He was the second leading receiver with 567 yards and 5 touchdowns. These 2 are going to be your mainstays of that room. They're going to be a pretty solid unit that Robertson's going to be able to throw to. You also bring back Michael Trigg, the tight end, who's a senior. He had 395 yards and 3 touchdowns. And then you bring in an Alabama transfer in Kobe Prentice. He only had 129 yards and 1 touchdown, but didn't play a ton last year at Alabama. So there's potential that you've got more opportunities there. And, you're pretty loaded there. So Robertson is going to be familiar with his guys. Like I said, you've got a backfield that is talented. You've got a wide receiver corps that is pretty talented, that has experience. And, it's going to be a great opportunity for them. And not to mention, you bring back 4 of your starting 5 starter. Let me rephrase that. You're bringing back 4 of the 5 starting offensive linemen who graded out decently. This was an offensive line that wasn't the best, but they're going to be solid. They're going to make their improvements from the year over. Anytime you can bring back that many starters, it's going to be a good thing, especially on the offensive line. So they do need to make their improvements in kind of what they do, but this is not a unit that you're going to be worried about. At least I don't think so. We'll see how it goes, but based on all of the talent that they have returning, this is a great opportunity for Baylor. That alone is why this Baylor squad is expected to be at the top of the Big 12. There's good reasons for it, right? You have this momentum coming into the end of the season. You have all of your returning talent, especially the guys, the impact players, and, you should be pretty solid. Teams can take steps back, but generally speaking, we don't see that. Barring injury or anything that way, we generally see a team that is going to be solid. Now, let's go to the defense. Defense doesn't have as much returning talent, but that's not to say that they're devoid of talent, right? You bring back Jackie Marshall, your defensive end. He had 24 pressures last year. Great at run defense, 87.2 grade from PFF. Pretty solid opportunity there. And then you bring in a really talented defensive lineman from Texas A&M, who as a freshman only had 20 snaps, but ranked pretty high in his run defensive grade, as well as just his overall defensive grade. This defensive line should be pretty stacked. They like to be aggressive. They like to win the trenches. You should be able to be good there. Linebackers, this is the 3-4 system, and so you're going to get generally that 3-4 system, so 4 linebackers. Some of them may be on the line, whatever that may be, but for the most part, that's kind of how Aranda likes to do it. They only return 1 of their starting linebackers in Keaton Thomas. 781 snaps last year, so a very experienced guy. Graded out decently. Nothing phenomenal, but definitely graded out well that he's going to come back and be a force in the middle of the field. You need that veteran unit to be able to, or veteran player to be able to help in that second unit and being able to help that defense. And so, he's going to be a solid asset there. They do bring in 3 linebackers in Kyler Jordan as an outside linebacker, Travion Barnes and an outside linebacker, and then Amarian Winston from Oregon. Majority of these guys outside of Travion Barnes from FIU, they've got limited snaps, and limited meaning they're under 300 snaps, right? So they've gotten enough playing experience that you can see something on tape, you can see how they are, but not to the level where they're full-time starters or things like that. So Travion Barnes had 717 snaps and graded out decently, so there's potential there. This can be a unit that, at the very least is on par with what last year's unit was, but there's potential that they can improve, that they can be better. We'll see how that comes together. But at least it's a good unit that brought in some players from the transfer portal that should be pretty solid. And then lastly, in your secondary, you return 3 guys that have some good experience in Caden Jenkins and Carl Williams IV at corners. You also then have Devin Bobby at safety. All of these guys have a decent amount of experience and graded out well. The 2 corners, they do give up a lot in passing, though. And so there's potential there. They can be ball hawks, but they haven't shown kind of that elite level yet. But they're still pretty solid, and I have to assume that they're going to be better this next year. Combined, the 2 of them had 8 pass breakups and 1 interception, So there's potential there, and you get them returning. You would have to assume that they improve. But then you also bring in Ohio State transfer corner Calvin Simpson Hunt, who only played for 6 snaps last year, but has a lot of potential. See what he can bring. And then in the safety spot, you bring in Devin Turner from Northwestern. Pretty solid, especially in the pass rush. He graded out as an 83.1 and was the 5th best player on that defense. And so, there's some talent coming in, a lot of great opportunities. Can this defense be better than, what they were last year? If they are, especially if that offense can be on par with what they were last year, this becomes a very dangerous team. Baylor is going to be the team that you don't want to overlook. Not that anybody's going to be overlooking them, but assuming that everything comes together the way that it's expected, this is a solid team that should be in contention for a Big 12 title. So we'll see what happens. Injuries can play their part. Teams cannot live up to the expectations. You start reading your own press clippings, that kind of stuff. That becomes a challenge, and we'll see what happens. It's easy to kind of buy into that momentum from last year and then kind of take things easy. You don't have that edge coming in. But I'd assume that this team is going to be hungry. By the time Utah plays them, though, this is going to be a situation where you know a ton about Baylor. They're either going to be good, they're going to be bad, they're going to be somewhere in the middle. Same with Utah, right? So we'll see what happens. Have they sustained the momentum from this last year? Are they even better on offense, especially in the red zone? Are they able to do what they need to? Can the defense make improvements and not lose them games? Those are the questions that's going to go into this team. So really solid unit. I generally tend to think that Phil Still's right here. I think this is probably one of the best teams in the conference. You can make your case for Arizona State as we did earlier. I still think that if I'm looking at both of these teams, I'm actually taking Baylor over Arizona State. We'll see, as I go into this a little further, as I make my Big 12 rankings before Media Day, if that holds up. But just looking at these 2 teams, at face value, looking at what they have, there's a lot to like about this Baylor squad. And I think if things hit right, they have far less questions that need to be answered than, let's say, in Arizona State, which sounds crazy, that returns basically every player on both sides of the ball. But I think that the Baylor unit can be maybe a little bit more elite, especially with the players that they have. So this is not a game that you're going to think twice on. This is a game that's going to get all of your attention, especially if Utah's in contention, especially if Baylor's in contention. It's going to be a tough out being on the road. I'd have to assume that Waco is way more, McLean Stadium, if I remember right, that's going to be a much more raucous environment than it was when Utah came 2 years ago. They were kind of a middling team that wasn't doing well, and the crowd there was probably more favorable to Utah, if we're being honest. But I have to imagine that stadium's going to be packed. If they're good, you're going to have a very loud environment. It would be great if it's a night environment where these two teams can play, especially coming off of a bye week. There's a lot of potential for a great opportunity in this game. So really fascinated by these two teams. Like I said, Cincinnati has a lot more questions. Baylor has less questions, but that's not to say that they don't have to live up to certain things. But I really like this Baylor squad. I think from the very beginning they have maybe not as much talent as Texas Tech on paper, but they have a complete unit that works together, that has done it in the past. They're not trying to gel all this unit together like Texas Tech will do. And so I have to think that they're going to be up there near the top. So with that, we're going to wrap up our episode today. That is, essentially the last time before, well, sorry, I rephrased that really poorly. This is, I don't even know what I'm saying there. Next week is the last time we talk about schedules because it's the last two games of the season. We'll call this the penultimate episode of schedule breakdowns. Not that means anything. It was a stupid thing. I caught myself. We're stuck. We're there. I got to explain that now. But I appreciate you listening. I appreciate you going on this journey with me as we kind of just give a brief overview of how these teams go. Next week, we're going to close out with Kansas State and Kansas, and then we'll preview Big 12 Media Days. We'll recap them once that's happened, and then we'll get into fall camp essentially. And so we're really at the door. We're getting closer. I hope you're excited for football coming back. I think there's a lot of fun that can be had this year. And, we're going to be able to talk about all of this as it goes on. So thanks for listening. We'll chat with you again next week, and we'll catch you later. Hope you're having a great summer.